Before the guns roar, the war is won in the dark by hands counting barrels, mending steel, refusing to let chaos win. Steel logistics, resupply, repair, and battlefield recovery begins in the dark, before the guns remember their names. When frost clings to fuel lines and breath comes out like the ghosts of old columns, in that hour the war is a warehouse of needs, calorie, spark, pressure, torque. The soldiers sleep in armored cocoons, but the road's long nerves are already twitching awake. There is a figure at the edge of the depot. Lights call him the Quartermaster, the archetype of thirst counting drums by touch, as if each barrel were a living rib. He is not a hero in murals. He is a metronome. He keeps time for everything that moves. It is there that the first arrangement of fate occurs, not at the front but beside pallets, where fuel is measured like blood in a hospital and powder like breath. The quartermaster speaks a quiet grammar to the night shift, and their verbs are lift, roll, seal, sign. You think war explodes, but mostly it organizes. You imagine heroism as a flame, but here it is, a ledger made of restraint. The men and women who push the pallets forward become a single creature, a many-handed animal whose religion is accuracy. They know the trucks by their temperaments, the one with a squealing belt, the one that drifts slightly on crowned roads, the one that always starts if spoken to with a wrench. Down the line, the mechanics form a second priesthood, acolytes of the patient blow. They put their faith not in shouting, but in torque curves and tolerances. There is the welder, hood down, halo bright, bringing two broken edges into one continuous thought. There is the electrician who feels current the way a poet feels meter. There is the machinist who considers the difference between almost and correct a form of morality. They live inside the paradox that saving a machine sometimes means breaking it first, loosening rusted valves, cutting seized bolts, drilling out the stubborn pins, confident that what is lost leaves room for what must be reborn. Their altar smells like solvent and damp canvas. Beyond them is a road chiseled from darkness. The convoy rolls out quiet, its headlights shaded, each vehicle tasting the frost with rubber tongues. In the cab of the lead truck sits the navigator, a woman whose memory is topographic culverts, copses, the suspicious ditch where wheels have a way of asking for mercy. She is an archetype of thread. She carries a line from depot to battery, from battery to breach, pulling the army through the fabric of night. When ambush threatens, her hands are iron, steering into a geometry of survival. When the road blurs, she names the trees like saints to keep fear from expanding. Urna, who think the world is shaped by the loudest detonation, count instead the quiet intervals. Count the 1,000 small obediences that keep the column one body. Count the posture of the loader, hands nicked and firm, passing shells in a rhythm filigreed with danger and grace. Count the soft chant of checks repeated habitually pressure, seal, latch that keep disaster asleep. The war wants you to believe in singular moments. These workers insist on sequence. They are not resisting glory. They are protecting it from randomness. At the forward line, steel is already tired. Tanks breathe through strangely human mouths, intakes that wheeze, radiators that steam, tracks that complain like knees. A night ago, they pushed past their scheduled grief and entered the zone where bravery is indistinguishable from wear. Now one sits crooked in the wheat stubble, final drive chewing itself like a dream. The crew marks a flare in the dirt, the color reserved for recovery and waits. Not in despair, but in a posture learned from farmers' care and watchfulness. To the east, the recovery team is coming. They arrive like a small constellation, a wrecker with an A-frame crane, a spare track carrier, a truck weighed down with chains and patience. These are the Salvors, the archetype carved from stubbornness. Their leader has a face lineated by sun, eyes that have measured many stuck things and refuse to let them stay. He understands leverage as a philosophical proposition. What is the pivot? Where is the fulcrum? How much faith weighs? His crew moves around the wounded tank with a tenderness that embarrasses the night. They talk to steel as if to an animal easy. Friend, breathe with us. Chains kiss hooks. Hooks kiss rings. And the first lift is not a lift at all, but a transfer of belief. The tank agrees to rise by degrees. You stand close enough to smell the scorched oil and old fear. The Salvors smell something else, the orchard under the tar. The machine's hidden memory of movement. They make a cradle out of links and angle iron, roll the track back on with barbaric grace, then lash the hole to the wrecker's sternum. This is not savagery, it is adoption. The convoy begins a reverse liturgy, inching away from the line with the disabled cradled like an inconvenient child who will nevertheless be taught to run again. Behind them, the guns keep speaking, but the recovery silence is a stronger argument. It says that nothing good will be abandoned. It says that the war may take, but the rear will not stop giving. The Salvors leave the track marks like a signature in the dew, a cursive of resolve. At the field workshop, the triage banners hang like austere flags: repair forward, repair rear, cannibalize. Each hull is a patient. The chief of diagnostics, the archetype of clarifier, walks with a stethoscope of stares, listening to idle, to rattle, to pause. The discipline is exacting and merciful, save what yields at once. Evacuate what needs time, harvest what refuses both. There is a coffin of parts in every battle, and it is called the boneyard. But even that is not death. It is reincarnation by socket and spline. A turret ring found a spoke on the other side of the yard. A pump wandered across the aisle into a vehicle that had forgotten how to pump anything but dread. The mechanics call this cannibalization, but the more ancient word is communion. You had thought that weapons demand courage at the point of contact. Learn now that tools in the rear demand another courage, the long kind. The anonymous kind that resists decay in schedule, and the crushing boredom that often threatens to become dread. Resupply is not a heroic noun. It is a verb done by hands that never appear in medals. Its power is cumulative. Its music is the clatter and hush of things becoming ready. There is also the fuel, black wine of movement, veins in rubber jackets. Its psychology is capricious. It wants clean filters and proper pressure, hates water, refuses dirt. It is shy of cold, surly in heat. There is a fuel chief who knows this temperament, who warms the fuel in winter and shades it in summer, who inspects couplings the way one inspects a promise. In the annals of battle, the fuel chief's name disappears, but the battle wrote itself on top of his choices. The tanks do not roll on bravery, they roll on combustibility shaped into docility by faithfulness. Some nights, the resupply comes under fire. Then the archetypes change their faces, but not their nature. The driver becomes the river finding channels in chaos. The warehouseman becomes the mountain absorbing shock and staying standing. The mechanic becomes the surgeon cutting and closing quickly, aware that delay bleeds out the day. Under bursts of tracer, the convoy executes an old ballet dispersion: concealment, lurch, stillness. You imagine panic. Instead, there is a studied slowness, a ritual of calm that humbles panic into obedience. The navigator's voice is a cool thread over the radio, pulling everyone through the needle's eye of hazard, and then dawn, which is nothing personal. Light spills into the yard and discovers in it a small cosmos, stacks of track pads like loaves, crates of bearings like planets imprisoned by wood, tents breathing quietly around sleepers who will soon be shoulders again. The war opens its mouth wide, hungry for mechanics of all kinds. A line of tanks arrives from refit, their paint scabbed, their exhausts relieved, their optics wiped with flannel like the eyes of children just cured. They will be fed ammo in ordered belts and cakes of grease, as if they are beasts that need both iron and kindness. The crews climb back in as if aboard a myth. The machines accept them with the formal courtesy of monarchs accustomed to carrying fragile, important kings who are simultaneously common men. If you listen keenly, you will hear the battlefield speaking to the rear and the rear answering. The language is technical and fierce, but underneath it lives something pastoral. Trucks move like shepherds, tanks like heavy weather, cranes like appointed angels. The archetypes weave themselves through the routines: keeper of thirst, patient hand, clarifier, salvors, river, mountain. No one stands alone. Each is strengthened by reciprocity. The courage of the gunner is fed by the reliability of the welder. The courage of the welder is fed by the certainty that the gunner will need him again. The war is a storm, yes, but it is also a system built to outlast the storm's childish violence. You wanted a single hero to step forward, to be cheered and framed. Instead, the narrative delivers a guild. You are being asked to widen the notion of valor until it holds a wrench and a dipstick and a barcode scanner. You are being asked to understand that what looks like drudgery is strategy's bloodstream, that repair is redemption, that recovery is a theology refusing to let the fallen rust unburied. Let the front glitter briefly, the back endures. At midday, the map opens like a wound and shows its edges: railhead, river crossing, choke point, orchard, ridge. The cartographer appears with a pencil already sharpened, the archetype of margin, sketching corridors with a tenderness that refuses to let columns blunder into the appetite of geography. He does not decorate, he limits. He marks where bridges will be born, where culverts will be reinforced, where a convoy must breathe between hedgerows because rockets like to graze open ground. Around him, runners lift acetate sheets as if lifting veils from faces that will soon be loved or feared. The map is not a prophecy, it is a diet, keeping the army lean enough to move. Before routes can be blessed, the sappers recite their old liturgy probe: uncover, render safe, mark. They are gardeners of danger, kneeling to feel the hidden teeth sown in earth by distant hands. One holds a whispering wand over crushed wheat and listens for what should not be there. Another scratches at a trigger plate with a knife steady as judgment. Their tape flags appear like a line of poppies across the ditch. A single mistake would turn a convoy into debris and a lesson. So they accept a speed slow enough to look almost like prayer. You have seen fast courage. Watch now the courage that refuses to rush. You can almost hear impatience grinding its own teeth while the sappers refuse to be bullied by the clock. On the riverbank, the bridge rights unload folded water. Pontoons unfurl like beetle wings. Girders find each other with clanging introductions and then settle into the long marriage of a span. The ferryman archetype presides, a person of measured voice whose certainty is always cheaper than panic. He knows that even a barrel of diesel needs a way to swim. On the far bank, the ground trembles, artillery feeling for the new rib thrown across the water. Camouflage nets droop like careful shadows. The first test vehicle edges out, heavy with trust. The bridge bows, then remembers that bowing is not braking. Soon fuel trucks and flatbeds roll over as if traveling a sentence that ends in purpose. Across the river, a forward refuel point breathes into being. Bladders flower under nets. Hoses coil like domesticated serpents. Berms grow around everything that smells like tomorrow. The fuel chief consults thermometers as if consulting a physician, keeps the pumps at a cadence that does not whip air into the lines. The air is busy with small radios and the low bark of generators. Vehicles arrive like livestock, noses forward, impatient to drink. Hot refuel is a delicate profanity. Engines still warm, crews still adrenal. The line a serpent that must not bite its tail. You imagine chaos, yet what arrives is choreography, a drill whose music is velocity without haste. There is a discipline to this that would shame a polished parade. Here, mistake becomes flame in seconds. And so hands choose correctness over speed, speed over pride. At the ammunition depot, the armorer reigns, the archetype of firekeeper. Wooden crates stack like books in a library that no one admits to reading for pleasure. She speaks in calibers, in lot numbers, in cautionary tales that always end with someone forgetting the grammar of fuses. Her crew moves shells as if moving eggs made of thunder. They mark polarity with chalk, wipe oil from hands that must remain kin to friction, but not enslaved by it. Belt links click together with a sound that feels like future. A loader from a frontline tank stands nearby, eyes measuring more than kilograms, calculating moments under pressure that will be spared or spent because this belt is packed clean. Yuaku who think courage happens only at the lip of the trench. Consider fingers here preventing catastrophe downrange by the simple art of noticing. There is a class of worker the Army never acknowledges loudly, yet cannot live without the forager. He is the archetype of improviser, moving through villages and scrapyards, through abandoned depots, through the enemy's old footprints, ferreting out the thread that will mend a ripped day. He speaks 6 dialects of scarcity, and all of them lead to a bolt pattern. In his truck ride, alternators with alien names, hoses that need translators called adapters, copper wire peeled from dead factories with a thief's delicacy and a saint's intention. When a pump made in a different world comes alive inside a friendly hull because the forager believed hard enough in threads and tap sets, the machine coughs and then clears its throat like a man deciding not to die. Back along the main supply route, the convoy commander reads the sky for weather that is thrown, not formed. He knows that ambush prefers the familiar pullout and the burning vehicle that becomes a signpost. He seeds his columns with spare space, the luxury that looks inefficient in a spreadsheet but saves breathing room when fire bites the air. The radio NCO is the archetype of nerve, speaking in brevity codes that hide a tenderness for every call sign. The point vehicle slows near the particular stand of poplars that always feels too eager. Outriders pause, flares arc. A drone sets its tiny eye above the canopy. The convoy moves again. You watch and notice how many crises dissolve because caution refused to be mocked. Inevitably, not all crises can be starved. An ammunition carrier is found by artillery. A crater opens beneath the rear axle. The world fills with dust and a sound like a vault slamming shut. The crew executes the brief liturgy of survival engine off. Doors open. Distance made. One returns to knock a jostled pallet into a safe attitude with the same reflex that once tucked in a child. Later, there will be a scar on his helmet and a suggestion of his name on the underside of victory, invisible to those who glance. The fire team rushes with extinguishers and quiet voices. Smoke rises without drama, then drifts away as if asked politely. The column breathes again. Not all stories of disaster end in ash when the rear has learned to answer quickly and without panic. Night collects around the rail yard, where the switchman writes in steel. He is the archetype of sequence, hands on levers that choose where mass will sleep. Flat cars couple, their kisses loud and practical. Cranes lift crates whose weight is measured in outcomes. Containers arrive like rib cages filled with organs, labeled for the body that will live because they do. The yard boss refuses to let the urgent murder the important. He stacks tomorrow where it can be found, not where it looks good. Over his shoulder, the locomotive huffs like an animal being fed. Rail is the spine of distance, and tonight it straightens. Behind a curtain of canvas, the machinists chase precision. They cut bushings that fit like apologies, turn shafts until the micrometer gives a small nod. The archetype of patient hand finds its apotheosis here, where 1/10 of a millimeter is the difference between a reclaimed engine and a stationary sculpture. The lathe sings, the press mutters, the bench smiles under a new bearing, driven home with a mallet that would be impatient if not for the human hand holding it. The newly rectangular meets the perfectly round, and a partnership begins that will tolerate heat, dust, and a gunner who has not slept well in a week. In a side tent, the optics team cleans glass that saw too much. They are secular monks of clarity. Lenses lie on felt like moon slices. Dust flees before air bulbs and camel hair brushes. They do not speak loudly, because glass remembers. Once assembled, the sight looks back at the world with a renewed adamance, ready to turn distance into decision. You, who love drama, may overlook the serenity of needles pointing true, yet many lives belong to these quiet custodians of alignment. Morning repeats itself with minor variations, a fugue written in diesel and sweat. The quartermaster walks the line and closes small loops with a pencil that has erased more than it has drawn. He is a calendar of metal. He knows that a bolt delivered on Tuesday becomes a charge across a field on Thursday. He knows that a missing rubber gasket will accrue casualties as surely as a sharp commander accrues victories. He cares without performance. The Army's breath deepens because he is dull in the exact way the heart is dull, pumping without complaint. At the edge of the refit yard, a hulking recovery crane idles, waiting to go forward again. Its operator is all risks and foresight. On the radio comes the call that a self-propelled gun has laid down its heartbeat too near a line of sight the enemy has already learned. Smoke is laid, not as a shield but as a gentle lie. The crane lumbers toward the lip of danger and settles into a crouch that looks like reverence. Chains are walked out. Hooks find anchor points like hands finding old friends. Under the uneasy hush between salvos, the wounded machine rises from the mud with a groan that sounds like a body remembering to trust. The crew follows on foot, carrying what cannot be replaced by parts their small inscriptions and private superstitions. The column folds them into its sternum and begins the long march back through corridors the cartographer once drew and the sappers once disciplined. Even angels, it seems, must learn to crouch. Back in the refit yard, the rescued gun stands in a posture of disbelief, armor streaked with smoke like old mascara. The assessors arrive with chalk and calipers, a tribunal of patience. They are the archetype of witness, eyes trained to separate drama from damage. One listens with a mechanic's stethoscope to the gearbox as if overhearing a confession. Another taps armor plate and hears, within each ring, the history of stress. Their verdicts are colors and codes: green for ready, amber for aches, red for sacrifice. You think repair is a single act. It is a parliament, and every vote is earned. When red is written, the sacrificer steps forward, torch in hand, a priest of necessary endings. Sparks lift like bees as plates are parted, hoses veined out of a hull, wiring looms laid down like hair on a comb. This is not desecration, but a last generosity, a pump given to another heart, a traverse motor passed to a turret that still wants to turn toward danger. He moves without sentiment, and yet carries it like gravity. You might want to protest on behalf of the noble dead. The sacrificer would answer that nobility is precisely why the dead must feed the living. In the parts tent, the provisioner keeps a small empire of scarcity. Shelves whisper in part numbers and promises. A ledger sits open like an exposed rib cage. Lead time becomes fate. Priorities become weather. She is the archetype of balance, forever weighing hunger against certainty, the immediate against the essential. A commander radios for 4 idlers and 5 road wheels. She answers with 2 idlers, 3 wheels, and a rerouted request wrapped in apology and steel. You imagine strategy as arrows on a map. She knows strategy as a finite box of bearings in the rain. At the track bench, pins are driven like stubborn nails of destiny. The track wrights labor 2 by 2, forearms roped, faces beautiful with black grease. A broken run unfurls across timbers like a serpent with a wound. They coax new shoes into old links and chase tolerances with files. Each click of a pin seat is a syllable in a language that means forward. When the loop is closed, they lay the run out straight and pass a hand along it with an affection not usually reserved for metal. You, who celebrate velocity, notice here the dignity of traction. Weather takes a side. Rain works tirelessly on behalf of stuckness. Cold teaches batteries to forget. The meteorologist is not a romantic. The sky is his spreadsheet. He is the archetype of forecasts, translating cloud grammar into axle loads and bridge capacities. Rasputitsa becomes a doctrine: don't promise what mud will deny. He briefs the convoy commander with an elegance of numbers that protects lives. Tomorrow, the trucks will carry timber to seed roads where there are none. Where timber sinks, brush will be woven. Where brush fails, patience will be ordered. You may despise the drag of nature, yet nature loves to test conviction. Logistics replies with adaptations that look humble and are sovereign. Night approaches, and the guardians of sleep sketch a perimeter with trip flares and quiet authority. The cooks drag steam from battered kettles, and broth becomes a logistics of the soul. The laundry detail hangs shirts that survive shrapnel but not sweat. A sleeve flaps like a flag of common life. Under canvas, the medics tend to fingers pinched by couplers and backs, anchored by too many lifts. They are healers of the workforce, gently suspicious of heroics that leave a wrench on the floor. Sleep is issued in watch bill segments, the most precious resupply of all. You who thrill to the roar of engines, Learn to revere the silence that keeps those engines true. In a radio truck dimly lit by green, the cipher clerk rotates keys with the reverence of a clockmaker. The network is a vascular system, and she keeps it oxygenated. Call signs glow like small constellations on a laminated sheet. When contact breaks, her calm becomes a bridge unseen. She is the archetype of continuity, refusing to let distance become exile. Through her headsets move requests, warnings, gratitude, the music of an army holding itself together with syntax. A single miscopied grid can tilt fate. Therefore, she writes slowly in a war that orders haste. Dawn ferries the rumor of an offensive that tastes like metal to the tongue. Ammunition stacks reorganize themselves into sequences that match the coming cadence. High explosive, smoke. Armor piercing, repeating like a drum line. The fuel chief has already run his fingers across filters and valves. The tanks will drink without coughing. The cartographer revises the margin and trims the fat from routes with a pen like a scalpel. The sappers carry fresh tape flags like a bouquet to lay along the arteries. In the command tent, a conductor of logistics raises an invisible baton at the exact moment the gun line will be lifting its voice. When the push begins, the arteries flex until their walls sing. A forward observation post requests smoke in 2 minutes. The armorer had already packed that pallet where the loaders could reach it with their eyes closed. A tank squadron chews a belt faster than the firekeeper predicted. The forager returns with 2 crates of enemy links that will be persuaded to marry friendly rounds. A bridge is shelled once, twice. The bridge right walks the span in the lull and hears in the timber's bow, enough strength for 1 more hour. You might call this improvisation. To them, it is fidelity. Failure still rehearses its entrances. A flatbed hits a culvert lip, misjudged by an inch, and scatters crates like teeth. A private with the nervous hands of an artist dives into the chaos, slaps safety caps back on fuses, kisses the dirt with his breath, and resets the day. On the net, the radio NCO's voice threads through static, wrapping units in precise instructions that sound like care. The convoy compresses, then elongates. Dispersion is a living creature trained to avoid artillery's appetite. Overhead, a small drone points with its quiet, nervous finger, and the navigator edits the road mid-sentence. At the forward repair point, the patient hand performs surgery without anesthesia. An engine deck rises on a gantry with the immodesty of an open thorax. Oil becomes confession. Filings become evidence. Heat maps become prophecies. The machinist delivers a shaft turned during the night to a tolerance kissed by luck and skill. It slides home with that exquisite little syllable, machines speak when they agree. The crew chief signs an initials-only signature on a form that history will never read. The vehicle lowers itself back into wholeness and shoulders its obligation without ceremony. Toward evening, the field kitchen sends a cart down the line, cups rattling. The drivers hold them with the same hands that know backlash and break fade. Steam softens faces until they look briefly like someone else's children. The war is still a furnace, but the rear keeps smuggling in small weather systems of mercy. You who came to measure magnitude begin to suspect that endurance is measured in teaspoons. The day closes with inventories that feel like prayers. Tools count themselves back into pouches. The provisioner updates the bad news into a plan. The cartographer sharpens the pencil he dulled. The meteorologist marks a front that will insist on detours. In a slit trench, the guardians of sleep look out at a dark that contains both menace and rest. The last radio check is a lullaby sung to trucks. Somewhere, the sacrificer lays his torch on a crate and touches with an oddly tender thumb the turret casing of the machine he unmade so others could move. Somewhere else, the Salvors coil their chains with the neatness of monks' rolling scrolls. What seems like repetition is actually a spiral, returning higher each time if discipline holds. The army ascends on a staircase of mundane excellences: tighten, top off, test, tag, tow, turn, transmit. You wanted fire. Fire requires tinder stacked neatly, oxygen managed, sparks shepherded, You wanted victory. Victory requires an ethics of bolts. Look down the corridor of the map and see not arrows but veins. See the heart you mistook for a warehouse. When a call cracks the net with coordinates that smell of danger, the recovery column tightens into a decision. A tank sits canted in a shell-bitten orchard, gun depressed, right track thrown, enemy sightlines greedy as hawks. The Salvors do not rush toward martyrdom. They convene a small orchestra in which every instrument plays defense. The covering guns begin a slow drumming, not rage but architecture, raising walls of concussion. The smokesmiths, artisans of weather, unroll their gray tapestries so that leaves, light, and the moment itself blur at the edges. The drone shepherd pushes a small machine into the sky, a nervous angel whose only power is seeing. Over the radio, the conductor speaks with a peculiar tenderness reserved for complicated tasks. Hold 2 mils left. Lift smoke by 50. Step the guns like stairs. The wrecker moves when told and not before. Patience. Here is armor. Chains rattle like a catechism. The wounded tank accepts the hooks as a patient accepts stitches. A crewman, shaking but certain, clambers out with the holy relics gunner's sight. Logbook, the mascot charm tied to a handle because recovery saves function and meaning both. The crane's boom marks, a stern eyelid closing against harm. For 1 corrupt second the smoke thins and a tracer burns a line in the orchard's dust. The shields step into their work, stacking blast-deflecting barriers with a speed that looks like stillness. The tank lifts, track looped back on with the persuasion of levers and profanity, and the convoy withdraws like a tide discipled to the moon. You call this luck. They call it well-fed caution. The rear knows that fire now has eyes and cheap wings. The electronic war team arrives without insignia, archetype of the silencer, and lays a hush across the air where hostile drones were learning to spell the convoy's name. Their antennas turn like sunflowers, but drink static. Frequencies are salted. Guidance loses its priest. Down the lane, the decoy rights perform their humble miracles, teaching canvas and scrap to imitate desire. A false tank rises from wood, pipe, and heat bricks, its silhouette trained to seduce an enemy sensor into confession. Later, a missile will bury itself in that counterfeit chest, and the real heart will keep beating. Deception here is not sin, it is a vaccine. Camouflage is a grammar of humility. The weaver walks the stacks with rolls of net and lengths of ghosted fabric, instructing color to stop shouting. She reads the palette of a meadow its chewy greens, its quick browns, and then scolds the depot for thinking itself exempt. Light discipline becomes a moral law. A cigarette ember is a rumor that can kill. Reflective tape a scream. You who love spectacle are asked to applaud dullness tarps drawn, doors closed, courtyards roofed with shadow. Logistics, to live, must learn to be boring. Under the hedgerow, another serpent is born, hose sections coupling into a forward fuel line, a soft pipeline that creeps behind concealment toward a thirsty battalion. The line dogs are hands and knees people, archetype of persistence, crawling, threading, clamping, bleeding air from the line like superstition from a story. They speak mantras of pressure and head, of lift and siphon, and you realize physics keeps a small chapel inside every war. Saboteurs bite the hose with teeth of wire and timed fire. The pipe layer shrugs, cuts out the cancer, sleeves in a patch, primes again. When the pump coughs and then clears its throat into a steady hum, the pump mistress smiles as if a baby has taken milk. Far away at the water's greedy lip, cranes compose a ballet of mass. The dock workers are the archetype of gravity tamed. Hooks find slings. Slings embrace crates whose labels are condensed hope. A stevedore with wrists like cable guides a flat car onto a ferry with a look that forgives no imprecision. On the quay, customs of war replace customs of trade, manifest read not for tax but for tempo. The quartermaster's inland twin stands with a grease pencil and divides abundance into necessity, then makes necessity obedient to rail gauge and axle load. Harbor wind chews at flags. Somewhere in a wheelhouse a horn speaks. And iron's long journey inland begins at the patient speed of schedule. The war breeds trash as eagerly as it breeds myth. In a fenced corner stand drums of used oil like dark sermons. Filters pile like withered fruit. The reclaimers are priests of aftermath. They separate poison from possibility, drain story from sludge. Solvents are caught and coaxed back into purity. Metal shavings find a path toward foundries where they will be remade into teeth. Black water runs to the purifier's tanks and emerges less cruel. You had not counted this labor in valor's ledger. Yet armies that neglect their filth learn quickly that filth will command them. Cleanliness is not ceremony, it is continuity. The fiercest enemy is neither shell nor mud. It is the whisper that shortcuts are harmless. Doubt prowls the depot as a tempter. Skip the torque spec, says doubt. Drive the bridge overweight just this once. Mix lots. No one will notice. The oath keeper lives for such murmurs. He is the archetype of refusal, and his power is saying no in a tone that never rises. He points to the ledger where near disasters are cataloged like contagion, to the bent pin kept as a saint's bone, to the photo of the truck that tried to bully physics and became a new shape of regret. Discipline, in his mouth, is not punishment. It is the raw material of mercy. When the day loosens its fist, the scribes emerge. They are archivists of friction and grace, heads bowed over forms that are not bureaucracy, but memory disciplined into usefulness. After-action reviews unfold as stories that have sworn off vanity. Here the mechanic admits misdiagnosis. The cartographer confesses a curve guessed wrong. The convoy commander applauds a private who saw what rank had missed. Lessons are harvested like grain and stored not in slogans, but in procedures. Tomorrow's survival is built from tonight's true sentences. You love also to forget. They try to do the opposite. The offensive moves the seam between front and rear, like a wound that heals by just enough. Forward repair points leapfrog assertively, bringing the patient hand closer to the edge where tools begin to tremble from percussion. A mobile lathe hums in a trailer, a welder beads inside a curtain of spark, a diagnostic tablet glows with hieroglyphs that tell the story of fuel rail pressure while rockets argue about meaning above. The Salvors have learned to work in the house of thunder. Chains are shortened for strength, slings double-wrapped. Ground guides speaking with open palms because voice is fickle under barrage. You call this madness. What you mean is devotion with good training. Night drops its black cloth, and the sky fills with the needles of remote curiosity. The silencers yawn and spin up again. The decoy rights plant new false blossoms in fields no one cared about yesterday. The guardians of sleep adjust watch bills to smear rest evenly across the weary. The kitchen exiles a little sweetness from its secret stores, and night becomes briefly kind. A mechanic falls asleep with a socket in hand and dreams not of home, but of a stubborn fastener finally giving up its pride. The war is a grinder, yet within the grind, people keep smuggling in gestures that deny the grinder an absolute victory. Across the river, the bridge that was shelled all morning receives a new sister downstream, born in silence, christened with mud. Redundancy is not extravagance. It is a way of refusing to be blackmailed by chance. The ferryman walks both spans and listens to the particular songs of their joints. He chooses the night's traffic pattern the way a farmer chooses furrows, with a respect for tired soil. The roots adjust like veins that have grown around scar tissue. You are watching resilience take architectural form. Before dawn, the map is thinner by a strip of enemy ground that ceased to belong to them without ever fully belonging to anyone else. The armorer's stacks are lower but not empty. The fuel bladders sit like sleeping seals. A few vehicles show the glaze of exhaustion. The patient hand will attend them in the order that keeps the day honest. The cipher clerk changes keys and the net inhales. Somewhere in the orchard that once hosted a wounded tank, the decoy wright's false beast still smolders contentedly. A small altar where a missile paid its zeal tax. The real tank rolls, its track newly faithful, its crew a little older in the eyes. You thought victory would smell like fireworks. It smells like hot oil not leaking, bearings not seizing, routes not guessed. You thought epics were written from the front? Epics are braided from the rear. The archetypes keep rotating through their human hosts: silencer, weaver, pipe layer, dockwright, reclaimer, oathkeeper, archivist. Each is a way to say no to entropy and yes to continuation. The guns will shout again. The cranes will answer. Between them runs the quiet grammar of survival, reinforced with chalk, rope, pressure, and the stubborn wish that nothing good will be abandoned. Dawn leans pale against the hangar doors and finds the foundry already awake, pouring new teeth for old gears as if restoring bite to a tired animal. The mold master is the archetype of repetition transformed. Hands remember temperatures even when gauges fail. Eyes read viscosity like a verse. Sand molds drink molten metal with meek courage and then harden into solutions. A rack of sprockets cools in a staggered choir, each one a promise that momentum will not be lost to a slipped link. Next door, the threadsmiths chase the spiral within the spiral, cutting bolts that fit receptors like a name finds a mouth. The smallness of the work is a kind of dominion. You, who praise sweeping plans, kneel here and admire the sovereignty of a thread. Across the yard, a low building keeps a steady hum, the battery house temple of captive storms. Cells sit in ranks, charging toward the kind of patience that can crank a frozen engine into a memory of warmth. The keeper of sparks walks between them with a hydrometer like a diviner's wand, reading gravity in the clear columns of liquid. Vent caps lift with a delicate pop. Steam kisses cold air and turns to warnings that drift away. In winter, batteries behave like sulking princes. In heat, they become greedy for water. The keeper balances both moods with dignified fussing. Somewhere in the future, a crew will turn a key, and a faithful growl will answer. That growl is being composed here, syllable by chemical syllable. Beyond the fence, the road climbs toward a pass where weather hoards grudges. The mountain route has its own dialect, and the convoy learns to speak it: split loads, double tractors, brake checks where cliffs listen for mistakes. The auditor of weight is a gaunt figure at the base, insisting that numbers respect gravity. He is the archetype of limit honored. His chalk marks send a pallet back until someone admits that the difference between 9 and 10 tons is the difference between descent and fall. The motor sergeant adds a sermon about engine braking that saves more lives than any single hero's audacity. Up on the spine of stone, drivers touch amulets that look like ordinary gear levers and move with the humility of climbers. Snowwrights cast grit from hoppers like seed, and the pass accepts their offering. Under canvas, a tool you do not expect hums softly, a cutter guided by coordinates rather than muscle. A plotter of gaskets, a bridge between scarcity and shape. The pattern reader feeds it sheets of composite. Outlines bloom with the authority of geometry. She is the archetype of exact hope, replacing the sermon of make do with the brighter song of make match. A gasket laid between flanges turns chaos into circulation. A shim placed under a bearing turns wobble into spin. None of this would impress a parade, yet parades need engines to ground their flags. At a forward repair point, a coolant line continues to whisper treachery, a pinhole that paints a green tear on armor. The thermos keeper of temperature's ethics arrives with clamps, sealant, and a sense of proportion. Overheating seduces commanders: push now, pay later. The thermist is allergic to later. Radiators receive a clean breath with compressed air. Fan belts learn new tension. A thermostat that loved the open position grudgingly returns to duty. Heat becomes a citizen again, not a tyrant. You, who love speed, recognize that speed without mercy burns out its own heart. Elsewhere, the quartering party lays out a hidden orchard for the fleet, a camouflage park where machines can sleep without inviting dreams of fire. The grove keeper reads shadows like a scholar, positions tarps to argue persuasively with the sun. Tracks creep over laid mats so no new scars lead eyes toward secrets. The light bafflers school crews in the etiquette of night curtains on slits. Red lamps, beams lowered to the angle of humility. Suspicion lives everywhere now in satellites' cold gaze, in microphones the size of a beetle. The art is to be unremarkable. The reward is continuance. A chaplain without vestments walks the refit lines, not to sprinkle water, but to broker truces between exhaustion and obligation. He is the archetype of breath. His liturgy is rotation. The line chiefs accept his arithmetic, an hour of sleep for the crew that stayed late to torque, half a watch for the driver who saw too much glass today. Next to the coffee urn, a bulletin appears, names not of heroes but of competences who can weld aluminum, who speaks enough of the enemy's tongue to parse their manuals, who can tune the stubborn carburetors on the older trucks that keep coming back like elder cousins. You expect hymns. Logistics sings rosters. At the rail junction, a new ritual begins transloading. Cranes pluck vehicles from flat cars with tenderness learned from mistakes. The switchman composes sequences where heavy and delicate do not collide. A reefer car exhales cold and delivers medicine whose labels are guarded like incantations, tourniquets, blood bags, antibiotics. The surgeon of hands, stationed in a tent near the maintenance bay, meets them with a nod that seals another covenant between rear and front. The medics in this theater fold their craft into logistics so tightly that the seam is artless, a pair of clean gloves waiting in a pocket beside a wrench, a splint fashioned from cratewood that later returns as framing for a field desk. Healing here is not a separate river. It is braided into the same current that carries grease and shells. The customizer has a shop that looks like a rumor bins of oddments, spools of wire, brackets of uncertain lineage. Crews bring problems that official manuals cannot bless, mount this filter, where it can be changed by someone with fingers like sausages. Root this hose away from a habit of chafing. Give the driver's seat a spine that allows duty to continue beyond the second hour. The customizer is the archetype of friend to function. Solutions leave his bench with welds that look like signatures and a quiet disclaimer. This is how the job gets done. Over time, these little edits become doctrine, then supply, then the illusion that they were always meant to be so. An alert spreads like a cool wind. A fuel dump in the forward orchard has been marked by enemy eyes. The disperser strides in with a map and a machete for habits. Tanks are bladdered in smaller herds. Berms multiply. Access lanes split into shy fingers. The mathematics of risk enters the conversation tactfully. A single lucky round will no longer write a paragraph of regret. Moving is work. Therefore, it is tempting to worship convenience. The disperser is a heretic in that church. You, who admire efficiency, learn to admire redundancy more. Evening paints metal with forgiveness. Flaring torches make small suns that do not brag. The oathkeeper circles, catching a sling misrigged by fatigue, a logbook missed by haste, a pressure test skipped by optimism. He speaks to the offender with respect. The offense is human. The consequences are not. On his belt hangs a bent shackle as a gnarled psalm. Fear of punishment is crude fuel. Love of continuance is cleaner. He teaches the latter and carries the former like a shadow that need not be invoked if the day is kept honest. Out beyond the perimeter, a scout team finds a bog loader that left its lane to save time and sank into the slow mouth of a ditch. The Salvors arrive not to scold, but to explain geometry with steel. Snatch blocks multiply the modest authority of a winch into a sermon. Angles become allies. Anchor points are appointed carefully, and the loader returns to competence with a shudder that imitates shame. The lesson rides back on the radio. Shortcuts have longer miles hidden in them. The map will add a new warning mark, one more comma in a sentence that learns to make sense. A storm gnaws the horizon, and with it the promise of silence. Rain drinks dust and makes roads honest about their structure. The meteorologist revises yesterday's doctrine and laces today's column with timber mats. The motor sergeant barks a change, tire pressures eased. Throttle discipline tightened. Following distances widened until a careless shell would need prophetic accuracy to punish a group. The convoy looks ungainly, then beautiful and animal adjusting gaits through mud. Each step conscious, none ashamed of slowness. Slowness is a virtue when the earth demands respect. In the dim of a tent, a chalkboard holds the record of a day that will not make headlines. Units serviced. Parts issued, hours driven without accident. Fires prevented, errors corrected before they could become nouns. The archivist writes it up so tomorrow's hands inherit more than grief. There is a mathematics to this war that folds emotion into equation. There is a tenderness that looks like neat handwriting. Under those numbers lives the old promise nothing good will be abandoned. Somewhere in the orchard, a crew flips a coin and laughs at its courage, then pockets it and checks their latches. Somewhere in the depot, the battery house hums and the foundry cools and the threadsmith wipes a spiral of metal from a jaw. Somewhere along the pass, the auditor of weight sleeps with his chalk in his pocket. Each of these unnamed moments anchors a larger motion. The front will surge again. The rear will feed it without dramatics. Between surge and feed stands a fellowship of archetypes, repetition transformed, sparks, limit honored, exact hope, breath, friend to function, disperser, oath keeper. Their language is simple, not yet broken, not yet empty, not yet done. You came to the story seeking thunder. The thunder is present, but 100 small weathers dominate the day. They are the gentle pressure of the right torque, the correct angle of a sling, the patient drain of a filter, the decision to break weight and try again tomorrow rather than lie to a bridge. This is the secret of steel logistics mercy. Toward material becomes mercy toward men. The machines are not loved for themselves. They are loved because they carry lives to work and home again, because they shoulder danger and then return to be made capable of shouldering it once more without dying of vanity. The offensive ripens into a harvest that refuses to be simple. Columns elongate across a plain that remembers cavalry and resents engines. Dust writes a thin scripture over everything and then dew edits it away. At the spear point, velocity tries to dictate, but behind it the long tail of necessity shapes a deeper syntax. The orchestrator of flow stands at a folding table under a tarp and moves tokens that are not tokens. Fuel, shells, bridge bays, rations, coolant, filters conducting a piece that cannot end if the song is to matter. He is the archetype of breath counted, counting not because of fear, but because love for continuance insists on arithmetic. Around him, runners crosshatch, a living abacus. Into this planned hunger strides the enemy of pattern. A rail bridge far to the rear takes a wound. The plan tries to inhale and coughs on its own surprise. The redirectionist, who keeps maps in layers like nerves, rotates routes through valleys no one wanted yesterday. He is the archetype of detour blessed, able to turn inconvenience into a quieter, safer stream. Rail becomes road. Road becomes trackway. Trackway becomes a procession across broken fields guided by white stones, set at dusk by soldiers who refuse to leave their brothers to the mercy of signage alone. You, who equate smoothness with competence, learn that competence often presents wearing the face of interruption survived. At the forward repair line, triage evolves. The patient hand receives a self-propelled gun with a cracked mount, a reconnaissance car with a carburetor sulking like a prince, and afraid of rumors about a new enemy munition that gnaws at optics. The clarifier gathers mechanics, gunners, and one suspiciously quiet radio man around a whiteboard dark with smudged diagrams. The archetype of synthesis steps forward a fix that is part hardware, part procedure, part superstition, baptized as policy. Optic hoods get a new bracing rib. Crews change the angle of park at night. A layer of canvas as humble as a kitchen apron suddenly has the dignity of doctrine. This is not improvisation's vanity, it is adaptation's humility. Resupply arrives with a smell no poet courts additives, preservatives. The cold breath of reefer units making their own weather. The quartermaster opens a crate of needles and sees transfusions for the army's moving blood. The cook unseals tins and thinks not of recipes, but of morale's chemistry. The surgeon of hands walks in from the tent beside the lathe, wipes iron filings from the air with a glance, and exchanges inventory nods with the provisioner. Healing, hunger, horsepower, each tongue speaks the same grammar: what comes in, what goes out, what must be held in reserve against the greed of circumstance. Then the storm arrives, not the weathered kind, but the deliberate kind, salvos striding methodically across parking lines and hedgerows. The guardians of sleep are suddenly guardians of flame. The smokesmiths lace the sky with gauze. The weaver slaps nets over reflective roofs and orders brake lights taped like blasphemies. The oathkeeper appears at the elbow of a private with a trembling cigarette and plucks ember from habit. The Salvors crouch in holes already dug for such days, eyes counting the beats between blasts the way a musician counts silence. When the percussion loosens its jaw, the column stands with bruises instead of breaks. The archivist's board will later show a figure for fires that almost were. It will look like bureaucracy to a hasty eye. It is actually a psalm of negations. The enemy is not the only hunter. The scavenger saint passes through the wake of battle with a congregation that includes riggers, clerks, and an old truck that smells like rope. Their mission is reclamation before the weather of men thieves. Children with bright curiosity. Despair strips the field to the bone. They tag ejecta for metallurgy. They coax abandoned toolkits back into civilized drawers. They fold scattered manuals into order. They lift hatches of knocked-out armor and remove what should be buried with privacy rather than traded for curiosity. The archetype here is respect. Respect for material that still has work in it. Respect for the names that use this material. You might call it tidying. It is a defense against the empire of loss. Elsewhere, the bridgewrights take on water that moves not politely, but with a veteran's cunning. A pontoon section has loosened in a tantrum, and the river smirks. The ferryman walks the bouncing ribs with a monkey's balance and a geometer's gaze. Dowels and pins bristling from a pouch like a hedgehog's counsel. A cable is paid out from a winch with kisses of spray. An anchor bites greedily into a bank that was advised to hold. The span rises by temper, then calms, then accepts the apology of new lashings. A tank rumbles over and does not become a lesson. You, who consider bridges merely in place, discover that they are relationships kept fresh by care. The long tail swats at flies called rumors. A whisper moves that filters are running low. The provisioner refuses panic and runs a quiet census, counting not in fear but in futures. The forager returns with a truckload of industrial filters reborn by bracketry and thread adapters, grinning like a thief who stole time. The customizer stamps ovals into circles, circles into compliance. The oathkeeper inspects the new marriage and signs with a slow nod. A convoy leaves the yard with lungs. At twilight, the chaplain of breath gathers volunteers to rebuild a road that the morning shells brokered back to its original state dirt, pretending it never made promises to wheels. The archetype of commons rises engineers with shovels, cooks with pry bars, a sergeant major with a memory of rural bridges. Timber appears with a speed that suggests magic. It is just attention that was paid earlier, returning now with interest. The passable becomes possible. The possible becomes today. In the distance, guns argue about metaphysics. Here, structure insists on ethics carry weight honestly or pay. Night teaches a lesson about light again. The light baffler's cover instrument clusters with kindness. The cipher clerk turns down the net's volume by drips until anxiety stops translating into chatter. The silencers paint static in necessary places. The decoy rights plant their false orchard not as insult but as offering a spare body for fate to mistake. In the hush, the battery house hums and the foundry glows, and the threadsmith leans close to a spiral that will decide, tomorrow, whether a wheel stays with its father. The next day throws the army a question with no punctuation. A forward fuel node goes dry 2 hours early because velocity outran arithmetic. The line dogs are already crawling, tapping a parallel vein the map once called theoretical. The pump mistress coaxes Prime into a reluctant heart and smiles when the gauge climbs like a child at a carnival. The disperser rearranges shadows to protect the new node's anonymity. A driver who expected blame receives a sandwich and an instruction to sleep. The orchestrator of flow erases a line with an odd gentleness and draws a better one with the same hand. Pride would double down. Logistics changes its mind. By now, the machines themselves have become narrators. An engine with fresh bearings purrs like a lesson, a final drive that was opened, cleaned, and baptized in oil holds its peace. A turret that once shuddered settles into a calm rotation that feels like ethical agreement. The patient hand stands aside and watches the line of vehicles exit with the posture of priests who believe in sacraments but do not insist on miracles. You, who crave climax, sense instead a deepening, not a single blaze of triumph, but a steady rise of competence until catastrophe loses its most common footholds. Midday brings a procession not often pictured: civilian carts, livestock, a schoolhouse in pieces on a truck bed whose tires look splayed by grief. The redirectionist and the guardians of sleep and the chaplain of breath step into a choreography that wasn't rehearsed but was always implied. Corridors open in the column. A tanker noses aside to let a grandmother's donkey pass without fear. A medic ties a sling for a boy who fell not from heroism, but from a tree he fled to in fright. Logistics is accused of coldness, yet here it warms everything it touches with order that makes room for tenderness. The guns go again, as they always do, and the salvors go again, as they must, into orchards that will someday be asked to forget. A wrecker returns at dusk with a tank that looks like a riddle half solved. The sacrificer is waiting with chalk and mercy. The archivist lights the board. The oathkeeper rests a hand on a misrigged chain and says quietly, "Once." The quartermaster moves a column of numbers by 3 and saves 100 miles of emptiness. The meteorologist leans into the tent and says the road will eat tires tonight if pressures aren't kissed. The drivers stoop and kiss rubber. And then, because even war concedes the occasional parable, a day passes too quietly. Engines idle like large cats content to be leashed. The battery house sings its low hymn without interruption. The foundry cools to a dull, pleased hum. The carts of civilians dwindle to a rumor of laughter. The disperser wanders the fuel bladders like a gardener admiring green fruit. In that hour, the orchestrator of flow closes his ledger for the day and looks not triumphant, but correct. The army has eaten well enough to move again tomorrow. You wanted a secret, a single gleaming rule. It is this: the rear is a temple of refusals. It refuses waste, neglect, arrogance, and the romance of shortcuts. It refuses to let the fallen rust unburied. It refuses to be seen only when it fails. Its priesthood recites homely litanies: tighten, torque, test, tag, tow, tally, and each homely word is a hinge that bears the weight of history turning. Let the front have its shout. The rear keeps the breath that makes shouting possible. The map's throat tightens where mountains fold into narrow gorges, and the rails thread through stone like a cautious thought. A demolition the enemy once promised finally arrives in the form of twisted track and a bridge span that stares at its own gap. The railrights dismount from flat cars with tools that look archaic and minds that are modern in their refusal to fold. They are the archetype of spine restored. Creosote breathes from new ties. Ballast shifts under boots like argument. A lining bar persuades steel to remember straightness. They sight down the rail with an old craftsman's squint and a young engineer's numbers, hammering fish plates until bolts accept partnership. The crane father lowers a temporary truss into the wound, and the river below sulks at being ignored. When the locomotive noses forward later, it does so like a veteran returning to work after grief quiet, competent, unwilling to talk about feelings, intent on delivering what must be delivered. Above the gorge, an airstrip exists only because ambition made a scar and called it runway. The air quartermaster stands beside pallets that dream of wings, the archetype of weight that flies. Nets cinch, straps sing, manifests square their shoulders. Loadmasters move with the tidiness of people whose mistakes fall from the sky. A pattern establishes itself in the dust lift. Arc, descend, disgorge, vanish. A loop of aluminum swallowed by cloud. Parachutes blossom over remote clearings with a domestic grace, bringing not romance but filters, medicine, spark plugs, brake linings, letters that smell like kitchens. You, who chase spectacle, are forced to admire the humility of gravity harnessed for kindness. On the ground, the signal garden grows. Masts climb, dishes nod, fiber slithers in conduits shielded from weather and malice. The keeper of voice is the archetype of reach. ensuring every station can whisper to every other across the teeth of terrain. Redundancy here is a design ethic, not an afterthought. When one ear goes deaf, two others lean in. In the radio shelter, a young specialist rewrites routing tables with a pencil, steady as prayer. Packets route around fresh injuries and arrive with their meanings intact. Where miscommunication would birth catastrophe, logistics plants antennas like windflowers and refuses to be lonely. Far forward, a tank limps in with a wound that is not dramatic but fatal if ignored, a weeping seal. A sulk in the transmission, a growl in the final drive that suggests a predator sharpening its teeth. The patient hand opens the hull like a surgeon opening a rib cage to shoo away an avoidable widowhood. The thermist measures not just temperature, but the rate at which heat becomes betrayal. The gear right reads wear patterns as oracles read tea leaves. They change what must be changed, polish what will live longer if honored, reshim the places where impatience once tried to make do. The machine lowers itself closed with a modest clunk that means survival. If you were to look for epiphany here, you would find instead competence, and that is the larger miracle. At the ration depot, the cook marshal orchestrates a campaign of warmth. Ovens roar without drama, pots think aloud in a language made of bubble and spice. The arithmetic of calories meets the arithmetic of miles, and morale becomes a measurable quantity, hot food within this many minutes of this many hours worked. He is the archetype of appetite answered. Knowing that anger melts in stew and weariness forgives when a sweet finds its way into a pocket. The line shuffles past with faces powdered in dust and diesel. Laughter returns in small coins. You, who believe iron moves armies, learn that soup does too. The standardizer walks with a satchel of stencils and a doctrine of compatibility. He is the archetype of many made one, reducing 15 types of filter to 3, turning a chaos of fasteners into a vocabulary that any wrench can speak. He redraws brackets so future parts agree to disagree less. He argues passionately with tradition and wins by showing the cost of stubbornness in hours misplaced and lives delayed. Manuals acquire supplements annotated by greasy hands that took notes as if writing love letters to tomorrow. What seems bureaucratic becomes an art of mercy, the right part found fast enough to save a day. Winter attempts a coup. Frost ambushes batteries. Oil stiffens into old grudges. Breath becomes visible opinions. The Wintermaster steps forward with doctrine sharpened into fleece and discipline. He orders fuel filtered as if it were a rare wine. Coolant ratios rewritten like laws. Heaters tested until they accept responsibility. Pre-dawn ritual multiplies warm-ups scheduled. Starters coaxed. Choke levers treated like relics. The convoy becomes a warm-blooded serpent winding through a world that would prefer the blood congeal. Snowwrights plow not just roads but habits. Ice is taught manners by gravel and patience. You will want to call winter the enemy. The Wintermaster insists it is an environment to be negotiated with respectfully. Out on the plain, a graveyard of machines grows where it must, fenced against scavengers and the easier kinds of forgetting. The Remembrancer curates it, the archetype of dead acknowledged. Tags hang from hulks like prayers in a language that didn't exist last year. Some will be mined for parts. Some will be towed home for resurrection. A few will be stripped to their honorable bones and finally laid to rest. The Remembrancer keeps a ledger of donations, a pump here that saved a platoon from walking, a turret gear there that allowed a gun to speak at the right second. Death, made useful, sits less heavily on the tongue. On the same horizon, a civilian caravan approaches, cautious, beautiful, infuriating. The redirectionist allocates a shepherd and a corridor, his voice a bridge between suspicion and relief. The guardians of sleep become guardians of passage. The chaplain of breath invents a schedule where there was only crisis. A mechanic crouches by a farmer's axle and gifts it grease. A nurse checks a grandmother's blood pressure with the competence of a practiced kindness. Logistics is accused of coldness. Logistics extends a hand, takes a breath, makes a lane. War does not turn tender because of this, but it becomes less stupid. The enemy of pattern learns and adjusts. Drones arrive like spiteful gnats, munitions that whisper before they poison. The silencers reweave their nets of absence. The decoy rites build an orchard of lies so convincing that even the men who made them feel briefly fooled. The weaver changes palette again, borrowing dust's color, stealing shadow's tricks. The light bafflers declare new commandments against reflections and laziness. The Oathkeeper walks the lines, checking each with a flashlight held low, speaking softly to the small carelessnesses that could invite a tragedy and sending them away. You, who once laughed at camouflage, begin to grasp it as a moral stance, choose humility or be consumed. In the maintenance tent, a young crew chief pins a hand-drawn diagram beside the official manual, a shortcut that is not a shortcut but a clearer path, sketched from midnight trials and corrected by Dawn's experience. The archivist photographs it into doctrine. The customizer machines a bracket that makes the sketch a kit. The provisioner negotiates with suppliers so the kit arrives as something that can be ordered, not just dreamed. An army evolves not by genius alone, but by permission granted to good ideas to become ordinary. At dusk, the road choir sings the sound of tires over timber mats, of tracks biting frozen earth with ceremonial restraint, of brake hiss and the honest cough of a diesel remembering its lineage. The motor sergeant walks the column with a listening face, the archetype of timbers and timing. He lays a hand on a wheel hub like a doctor taking a pulse and orders a stop where heat tells a story of friction about to declare independence. A 10-minute pause averts a 10-hour catastrophe. The discipline to pause is a kind of bravery too. The day's final act belongs to the counters. In a tent bright as an idea, the orchestrator of flow leans over a board where tokens migrate like weather. Beside him, the meteorologist updates predictions not of rain, but of mud behaving like water. The standardizer marks a list of conversions completed. The quartermaster crosses out shortages conquered and circles shortages that will try again tomorrow. The cipher clerk transmits in a ribbon of calm, and the scribes capture the bloodless heroics in prose that will never be read on a parade ground, but will save more than parades ever earned. The Fellowship of Archetypes stands tired and undefeated, spine restored. Weight that flies, reach. Appetite answered. Many made one. Wintermaster. Debt acknowledged. Timbers and timing. Night returns with its old bargain, hide well. Move quietly. Keep honest inventory. Sleep enough to remain human. Somewhere along the rails, the locomotive's steady heart knocks on miles until miles open. Somewhere in the hangar, a pallet dreams of being a wing again. Somewhere in the field kitchen, a ladle rests like a scepter that rules a small kingdom of warmth. Somewhere at the perimeter, a sentry listens to crickets and radios and thinks about bridges that hold because hands held their doctrine. We who followed thunder to this place, understand now that thunder feeds on little flames tended far from applause. The offensive continues not as drama repeated, but as competence accumulated. Tomorrow there will be another bridge to persuade, another hose to quiet, another rumor to correct, another bearing to ease, another letter to deliver, another decoy to plant, another after-action sentence to write with enough humility that it teaches rather than boasts. Between front and rear, the artery thickens, cleans itself, refuses to scar shut. Steel logistics is not a subplot, it is the nervous system of the plot. When it sings, whole armies remember their lines. Urban edges arrive like teeth, a city gnawing at the margins of fields and habits. Blocks present themselves as puzzles with missing pieces, streets narrowed by rubble into opinions, intersections haunted by glass. Logistics adds a new dialect to its tongue doorways, stairwells, alleys that bend twice before allowing truth to pass. The quartermaster's line items acquire a civic accent ramps, pry bars, hydraulic spreaders, spare bulbs for the signals that still believe in order. The orchestrator of flow now rehearses a ballet where forklifts court silence and pallets tiptoe through courtyards watched by windows that might be eyes or barrels. The archetype of passage appears in a yellow vest and directs a convoy the way a librarian directs an argument, shushing noise, pointing to structure, insisting that every volume finds its shelf. The city has its own guardians. The mason engineer measures cracks with a lover's worry and declares which facades will hold their breath and which will exhale bricks. He props up arches with timber and persuades lintels to forgive. He is the archetype of shelter restored, stitching habitability from nervous stone. Into these rescued rooms, logistics plants small kingdoms, a dispensary where a bandage becomes an armistice, a charging station where radios drink, a kitchen that decides to love everyone who arrives with a bowl. You, who came to count shells, begin to count chairs. The enemy knows that cities amplify both courage and cruelty. Drones wander avenues like rumors. Artillery insists that geometry is destiny. The weaver rewrites the skyline with nets draped from eaves to eaves, turning alleys into soft tunnels. The smokesmiths use chimneys and courtyards to fold air into veils that protect motions best done unannounced. The silencers lay hush over control links and seed the air with decoys that blink like plausible desires. It looks like magic if you squint. It is merely competence wearing the costume of weather. Inside an old tram depot, the workshop of necessary fictions hums. The decoy rights teach plywood to impersonate armor. Paint tarps with the fierce tenderness of portraitists. Wire heat bricks to mimic engine hearts. On the loading bay, a row of false beasts stands ready to attract anger. Twin to them are the humble saints of concealment racks that fold into walls, doors painted with the grammar of neglect, crates that hide the mouths of radios. Do not be interesting, the oath keeper murmurs to every reflection, every gleam, every sentimental light. To live in an urban war, you must learn anonymity as a craft. The Salvors' vocation adjusts to doorframes. Instead of orchards, they navigate basements. Instead of hedgerows, they consider stairwells whose weight limits were written for groceries and gossip. A damaged infantry carrier slumps against a fountain whose pigeons have gone on strike. The crane cannot enter the square. Geometry bans heroics. The Salvors unspool a catechism of snatch blocks and take the load sideways through a cloistered corridor of force. Asphalt sighs, cables sing. A statue of a forgotten mayor earns a new memory by becoming an anchor point. The carrier slides, pivots, yields to persuasion, disappears into a garage where healing is allowed. You, who admire brute strength, notice the elegance of angles apologizing to mass. The patient hand goes domestic. Floors become operating tables. Windows become exhaust paths. Stair treads learn the weight of engine blocks carried in slings like uncommon furniture. A turret ring is lapped with paste on a lazy Susan from a shattered kitchen. The customizer rehomes a filter with brackets forged from balcony rail. A broken handle becomes a lever fashioned from a chair leg, now sanded and proud. Manuals acquire marginalia that smell like coffee and dust. Adaptation is not an affront. It is fidelity to function when the world changes the location of its screws. Civilians become co-authors of continuance. A baker offers oven time to sterilize surgical tools. A tailor reinforces sling straps. A school's physics teacher adjusts a generator's governor with a patience born of chalk. The chaplain of breath brokers a marketplace of skills where currencies are gratitude and time. The provisioner bargains not with coin, but with deliveries, flour traded for grease, socket set for antibiotics. A repair of the community pump paid in a day's access to the municipal courtyard for staging. Logistics is accused of being merely mechanical. Here it reveals itself as social engineering done with kindness and ledger lines. The remembrancer walks the city with tags that do not keep score of kills, but of kindness street corners, where corridors open for convoys carrying medicine. Staircases that bore too much and did not complain. A garden where a forward fuel node hid under trellised vines whose leaves learned the art of discretion. He keeps a roll of names from crews and neighbors who made that discretion possible, a litany to be spoken when peace remembers it has a voice. To some, this seems like sentiment. To the rear, it is doctrine. Morale anchored to memory is harder to starve. Meanwhile, far from facades and courtyards, the country's spine continues its quiet exhalations. Railheads exchange iron lungs with road arteries. The air quartermaster sends parachutes to villages whose maps only recently received their names. The mountain route asks again for respect and receives it. The winter master's breath fogs in the air as he adjusts schedules so engines warm before they are asked to serve. The Bridgewrights visit their children's spans across rivers that never stop practicing their escape and feed them new pins and fresh vows. You forget how many parents a crossing requires until you count them at dusk. Rumor returns, as tireless as weather. Filters again, or bearings, or a certain type of seal with a desire to evaporate from inventory. The provisioner smiles, a predator of shortages. She lays out the bones of the problem and invites predators on her side. The forager promises a pilgrimage to a warehouse rumored to be under a defunct cinema. The standardizer suggests a conversion kit that will let similar seals stand in for the absent ones. The Oathkeeper blesses the plan with conditions about testing and labeling that keep ingenuity from becoming arrogance. By tomorrow, a new normal exists and pretends it was always there. You want to credit genius. Credit procedure that respects genius enough to make it safe. The city teaches new courtesies to column and crew. Horns are forbidden. Hand signals inherit authority. A tanker learns to be gentle with its shadow, hugging one wall to avoid turning the street into a sunlit line of revelation. The light bafflers wrap rear lamps with a priest's care. The navigator thinks in layers: first-floor load-bearing walls, second-story sightlines, rooftops with appetites. She becomes the archetype of thread inside a labyrinth. Counting turns not in distance, but in risk. When she orders a halt because a child chases a ball, the convoy obeys with the reverence due a life. War can be taught manners. It just needs instructors who will not accept its excuses. All the while, the workshop of exact hope keeps making shims and gaskets, and the foundry pours teeth and the battery house nurses storms. But their songs bend to an urban key. Bolts are cut shorter because access is mean. Handles are braced against corners. Sight hoods are given little hats to defeat glare from a window nobody noticed yesterday. In a back room, the optics team tunes glass that caught a ricochet of light and became a beacon for enemy devices. Felt pads and micro baffles now teach the world to ignore that glass. Do not shine, the weaver writes in chalk above the bench, and the bench begins to believe. One evening, the guardians of sleep rotate into the role of guardians of conversation. The kitchen ladles soup in a courtyard where mortar scars look like constellations. Crews and neighbors share benches. The cipher clerk, off-duty and human, sketches cartoons of forklifts with eyelashes. A grandmother laughs and corrects the eyelashes. The archivist listens with the face of a student and captures not gossip but patterns when shelling pauses. Where water pressure returns first, which roofs hold weight. Tomorrow these will become routes and schedules. Tonight, they are simply human exchanges that defend sanity. You, who suspect logistics of coldness, watch warmth move like a carefully tended flame from bowl to bowl. Then the city exacts its tithe. A forward refuel point, perfectly hidden from heaven's eyes, is betrayed by a pedestrian angle, a mirror on a balcony, a splash of sunlight from an open door. The strike is precise, the blast rude. The disperser's doctrine pays for itself as tanks rupture one by one instead of en masse. Berms scold flame back toward humility. The smokesmiths write a fast elegy in gray while extinguishers speak curtly. The Oathkeeper finds a safety cap on the ground and lifts it the way one lifts a lesson. The loss is real, but so is the refusal to let it multiply. The archivist will write a dry sentence that saves lives for months. Canopies will include anti-specular fringe. Adjacent access doors will be draped at refuel. A day later, the convoy rolls again. Gentler, wiser, on a roof. The weaver adjusts netting to teach sunlight to move differently. On a corner, the mason engineer replaces a keystone in a doorway that decided not to collapse after all. In the tram depot, a decoy burns in place of a friend. In the battery house, a charge reaches a polite plateau. In the foundry, a sprocket loses its heat and gains its strength. In the workshop of necessary fictions, the painters laugh at a dog who has decided the false tank is home. In the quartermaster's tent, a pencil scratches a subtraction, and then, in another column, an addition that will reconcile the day with tomorrow. You wanted the war to be a single line. It is a braid front and rear, city and field, iron and flesh, Ledger and lullaby. The archetypes continue their procession passage. Shelter restored, anonymous weather, angled persuasion, social ledger, debt acknowledged, thread in labyrinth. Each is a way of saying no to the entropy that likes to dress in uniforms and call itself destiny. Each refuses to let the fallen rust unburied. Each believes in continuance the way lungs believe in air. When the front inhales, the rear exhales. When the rear hesitates, the front suffocates. So they do not hesitate. Night falls again, honest and impartial. The signal garden whispers to itself. The salvors coil their ropes. The oathkeeper lays a bent shackle on the edge of a barrel and smooths it with his thumb. Not out of superstition, but respect. The chaplain of breath checks the rotation and smiles where a name with too many hours has been replaced by a name with enough. The meteorologist marks a cold front like an incoming thought and adjusts tomorrow's start times so engines do not struggle needlessly against frost. The city sleeps in pockets and pretends at peace. Under it, logistics keeps its warm vow. Dawn crawls out of the alleys and climbs into antennas. A new day begins with passwords, not bugles. The signal garden breathes, and the network wardens walk its paths with tablets that glow like careful fireflies. They are the archetype of pulse kept, tending routers as if they were beehives. Packets skate from depot to bridge to forward park. A request for bearings takes a route through 3 backups and arrives shy by 2 seconds, which is just enough to save a voice from rising. Redundancy becomes etiquette. You, who admire straight lines, learn to praise meshes, inside a container cooled to the temperature of thought. The ledger of wear tells stories to anyone patient enough to listen. Sensors whisper through looms to a small cathedral of screens where the clarifier's cousin, the diagnost, rests his palms and reads stress like a weather map. Heat signatures bloom and fade. A vibration curve sulks. A fuel pump shows a tremor that predicts tomorrow's stall. The diagnost is the archetype of prevention, shifting fate by centimeters and hours. He prints a tag and a warning. A crew that might have fought a roadside death instead meets a wrench at noon. Catastrophe keeps failing to find its cues. In a tent that smells of resin and tool steel, the pattern reader's sister hums at a printer that exudes small miracles. A shattered knob becomes a new knob. A shroud arrives layer by layer until it can teach dust to mind its business. The fabricators are the archetype of make it now. They respect tolerances like vows, yet treat material with lively disrespect, polymers married to aluminum. Steel flirted into odd shapes that manuals never imagined. A bracket born in the afternoon rides a tank by dusk and refuses to let a cable chafe itself into treason. Genius is a large word. This shop prefers useful. Heat returns like a tax. Midday lifts mirage out of asphalt, and engines pant. The thermist reopens her catechism-shade vehicles in rotation. Vent bays like lungs. Bleed cooling systems that think steam is a personality. Fuel turns sullen at the nozzle. Filters sweat. The Wintermaster lends his opposite number a page. Hot weather doctrine is merely cold weather doctrine taught to drink water. Rations acquire salt with intent. The cook marshal counts not just calories but minerals that keep hands from shaking when bolts demand obedience. You thought logistics fed machines. Logistics coaches bodies through climates that want them back. On a boulevard whose trees remember peace, the orchestrator of flow sets a quiet trap for chaos rehearsal. Forklifts and drivers practice the ballet of evacuation while the day is still friendly. Nets fly, pallets kneel, straps sing. The drill master, an archetype of future saved, times the motions and finds a second here, a stumble there. When the first siren later loops itself into the air, the dance repeats with no costume, changes, or speeches. The courtyard empties like a magician's pocket. Order was not improvised. It was rehearsed in daylight and carried into dusk. A rumor arrives honest enough to be frightening interdiction teams hunting the artery. The redirectionist unrolls the palimpsest of routes and rubs a thumb across an old line until a new line shows. The convoy commander studies the map with a diver's squint and teaches the column a different way to breathe shorter bounds. More scouts. Pauses that look like humility rather than fear. The drone shepherd releases small eyes like dandelion seeds into the contested air. The silencers paint static where hostile ears once drank greedily. A convoy that might have become a headline becomes a paragraph that did not need to be written. Far forward, the Salvors meet a puzzle in a cul-de-sac grown mean with glass. A recovery strap must kiss a tow hook the city denies them space to see. Angles argue, the Oathkeeper kneels, checks a shackle with fingers that remember the tragedies of haste, and approves the rig only when geometry relents. The carrier comes out sideways, then backward, then suddenly forward as if proud. No one cheers. The crane retreats with the cat-like arrogance of a machine that knows its gift. In a gymnasium that smells of chalk and rubber, the chaplain of breath hosts a cathedral of repetition. Crews practice the sacred trivialities ladder carries, hand signals in thick gloves, hose swaps blindfolded, the choreography of hot refuel whispered rather than shouted. Laughter appears like a friendly inspector. Mistakes are paid for in push-ups and praise. The archivist films, annotates, and later stitches these drills into doctrine with thread finer than pride. The army learns to become a school when thunder sleeps. Night invents its own problems. A blackout brings quiet and temptation. Doubt prowls the perimeter in slippers. Who will know if the light shines for a second? The Oathkeeper's lantern moves like a slow comet. He finds a careless glow on a clipboard and snuffs it as if pinching a rumor. He doesn't bark. He reminds. Fear makes compliance. Respect makes culture. His pocket holds the bent shackle and a photograph of a truck that tried to bully physics on a dark bridge and became a fable. Neither talisman is theatrical. Both are persuasive. The city's sewer system offers a gift. The map forgot a dry channel beneath a block where ambushes bloom. The forager has heard it from a plumber, who heard it from a boy, who tracked a stray dog with a talent for finding places men ignore. The thread in labyrinth descends with a light that points at her boots instead of the walls. She measures clearances, counts hatches, listens to the way echoes lie, and returns with a route that will spare 3 blocks of vulnerability. The disperser stamps it conditional, weather permitting, bless the plumbers and alters the schedule. Logistics devours gossip and digests it into corridors. The remembrancer pins new tags on the wall of names. Not of the dead, but of the saved, a driver who braked because the meteorologist whispered black ice at the correct minute. A loader who noticed the wrong lot number in a crate that would have spoiled a gun's appetite. A tailor who reinforced a sling that lifted a heart out of rubble. Valor broadens until it fits every hand that refused to be lazy. You, who once believed recognition must be rare to be meaningful. Watch meaning multiply when gratitude is precise. Some mornings bring letters, paper with kitchen scents, screens that carry faces from beyond the map's edges. The orchestrator of flow allocates time to tenderness, like a miser who loves what he hoards. Laughter butts heads with tears under awnings. A welder watches a toddler blow kisses toward the mask and pretends not to cry. Morale is often described as wind. Today it is a shawl laid over shoulders. The cook marshal sneaks sweetness onto trays and claims inventory errors when caught. The quartermaster pretends to believe the lie because kindness is line item under unreported shrinkage where accountants fear to tread. Elsewhere, the standardizer completes a quiet coup. 5 kinds of hose clamp vanish into 1. A dozen paint codes shrink to 3. The parts wall looks less like a thrift store and more like a sentence with subject and verb. Mechanics stop cursing suppliers and start cursing only weather and fate. The customizer, unthreatened, grins and asks for lashings in the new sizes. Improvisation thrives best in cultures where baseline agreement exists. Procedure does not kill creativity. It gives it a stage. Afternoon births a bad hour. A strike chews a forward park that had hidden perfectly until a window decided to flash the wrong truth. Fire reaches for bladders. Smoke tries to become panic. The smokesmiths write over the enemy's ink. The disperser's prearranged muscle memory splits the fuel herd. The firekeepers, who were armorer yesterday and might be track right tomorrow, knock heat down with foam like men baptizing a frantic river. The loss is numbered. The loss is contained. The archivist writes the dry sentence that will save lives. Mirrors will be draped at fenestration. Refuel lanes will kink twice to deny ballistic straightness. Grief becomes grammar. At twilight, the bridge rights visit a pontoon span that has begun to sulk under traffic. They confess to it with wrenches, swap a tired pin for a bright one, tighten lashings that sighed a little too much at noon. A tank crosses and does not become a footnote. Downriver, a new sister span waits with the patience of redundancy. Bridges do not enjoy gratitude, but they hold it well. In the maintenance paddock, the patient hand confronts a final drive that insists on making glitter in its oil, the metallic confetti of pending failure. The gearwright frowns and measures backlash like a monk tasting soup. Shims migrate with intention. Torque wrenches click in a language that refuses poetry because accuracy is already beautiful. The rebuilt drive hums with modest pride. A crew climbs back aboard and leans their heads briefly against the armor with the affection soldiers pretend not to feel. Machines are not loved as pets. They are respected as companions that willingly accept risk in exchange for care. Night parades rituals that look like superstition and are actually statistics. Tire pressures kiss gently. Logs close neatly. Inventories sworn to under the oath keeper's slow gaze. The cipher clerk changes keys, and the net inhales like a singer finding breath. The meteorologist draws shapes of tomorrow's heat with a finger that taps once where shade must be staged at noon. The chaplain of breath swaps watches so a name on the board regains its humanity by sleeping. The foundry glows. The battery house hums. The fabricators print one last gasket that will be a sentence fragment in the long paragraph of survival. You wanted crescendo. The music insists on cadence. The archetypes keep their procession pulse kept. Prevention, make it now, future saved, detour blessed, mesh of mercy, exact practice, culture of refusal. Each is a manner of saying no to the small treasons that become large funerals. Each is a way of promising that nothing good will be abandoned. The front inhales, certain that the rear has taught the lungs to keep steady time. The rear exhales, certain that the front will need breath again at dawn. Between inhale and exhale, the war persists, and so does mercy. Measured, numbered, rehearsed, repaired. The campaign bends toward a hush that is not yet peace. The guns start to speak in past tense more often than present, and the map slims down as if after fever. Columns shorten, traffic grows domestic in its patience, and the air acquires the odd, guilty freshness of rain after a long factory shift. Logistics does not stand down. It modulates. The orchestrator of flow closes one artery a day and opens 3 capillaries of goodwill relief wagons, repair crews for municipal pumps. Pallets of roofing felt that smell like honest work. The archetype of harvest without triumph steps into view, gathering what can be saved from fields of ruin. You, who wanted finales with trumpets, are asked instead to admire the decency of careful endings. Across the forward line, the Salvors now find more silence than salvos. Their craft turns toward repatriation. They lift what can return and tag what must sleep. A recovery team kneels beside a broken bridge guardrail and straightens it not because the convoy demands it, but because someone will walk here tomorrow with a child. Chains clink like modest bells. The oath keeper still makes his rounds, but his lantern reveals different errors, a cache of munitions that needs the respectful hush of sandbags, a decal that should be peeled from a wall before memory hardens into grievance. He is the archetype of mercy procedural, teaching that the rules for victory overlap the rules for repair. In depots, the patient hand writes a new ledger with columns titled Return to Service and Return to Soil. Machines that survived their hardest miles are cleaned like bodies prepared for a dignified wake, then stored with preservatives and a note tied to each last serviced. Next due, known temperaments. Others are stripped to honorable bones and sent to the remembrancer's care. Plates are saved for memorials. An instrument panel becomes a classroom's altar of mechanisms. A track shoe becomes a doorstop in a municipal office, where future complaints will sound less apocalyptic against its mute weight. You think in binaries of war and peace. Logistics speaks in gradients of stewardship. The standardizer presides over a gentle unification, turning war's jerry-rigged genius into peacetime's manufacturable sanity. Conversion kits acquire part numbers that promise dependability. Field fixes with reputations earn official drawings. Improvisations that were brave but brittle are retired with thanks. Supply lines start bringing books and bolts in the same truck. The customizer grins and agrees to become a teacher. His bench a small academy where apprentices learn that elegance in metal is the same as kindness in practice, nothing sharp without reason, nothing complicated that does not also forgive. In the signal garden, the keeper of voice routes surplus bandwidth toward voice's long-starved clinics, schools, a midwife who will trade a radio lesson for a class on breath. Routers that once carried coordinates now carry homework and market prices. The cipher clerk rotates keys one last time and puts away the bent pencil that survived a season of urgency, then teaches a town council how to keep redundant backups for elections and storms. You were told logistics is cold. Logistics turns out to be an ethics of reach. The Wintermaster and Thermist, those adversarial siblings, collaborate on a calendar of care for a city that must live through both fever and frost, insulation blankets meant for bladders, wrap pipes in basement catacombs. Radiator doctrine becomes neighborhood advice, bleed lines, watch gauges, respect heat. The cook marshal turns ration math into community kitchens, where recipes travel like treaties. A pot of soup their teams perfected in shell-slashed courtyards becomes a standard for comfort in a school gym. And the line that forms each noon carries laughter with a complicated accent. At the rail yard, the railrights swap trusses that were always provisional for spans that dream decades. The crane father lowers steel with a tenderness that would embarrass anyone who didn't watch bridges die for lack of such hands. Crews sandblast slogans from girders and replace them with load ratings and inspection dates. Rhetoric yields to maintenance. A locomotive noses through the gorge again, this time whistling for foot traffic because the rails have decided to remember courtesy. The archetype of spine restored now learns to stretch. Airfields unspool into commerce. The air quartermaster weighs crates that smell like citrus and textbooks, counts parachutes that will bloom on festivals rather than in forests, and teaches the doctrine of enough to partners who only learn more. Loadmasters, still precise, now argue about how to strap washing machines without bruising them. A pallet marked filters still arrives, but for wells and school labs, you who chase the theater of danger. Notice the lovelier theater of ordinariness performed with the same choreography and nearly the same suspense. In the city, the mason engineers' timber props come down one careful brace at a time. Walls tested by blast and bearing, having survived, receive honest repairs instead of flattery. The workshop of necessary fictions closes its stage doors and reopens as a workshop of necessary furnishings doors that close. Window latches that respect weather, benches for courts that may someday judge less savage disputes. Decoy rights repaint plywood into playgrounds. The weaver refashions nets into shade cloth for market stalls. The light bafflers cut the tape from lamps and mount them under new commandments. Shine when loved ones walk. The chaplain of breath becomes the keeper of rhythm. Watch bills evolve into community rosters. Crews who once guarded quarantine nights now guard festivals and bridge maintenance days. The guardians of sleep teach street committees how to hear the difference between danger and loudness. The meteorologist joins the irrigation board and speaks of water with the same caution used for mud. Forecasts still save lives, but now from flood and drought rather than artillery and ice. Discipline proves itself the common ancestor of survival and prosperity. Rumors remain because rumor is human. The provisioner meets them in the open square with ledgers now written for citizens' parts on hand. Fuel receipts, medicines in storage. She moves a finger down columns and demonstrates that transparency is not a threat to resilience. It is the muscle that lets resilience flex without tearing. The forager gets a new license and a sign that says, surplus salvage, and his truck returns from pilgrimages bearing window glass and school desks as often as it once bore road wheels and pumps. The oathkeeper tacks a new notice to the depot board. Shortcuts will be returned to sender. A procession forms that no one rehearsed and everyone understands. The remembrancer leads it beneath spans that held past fuel parks that learned humility, along roads where timber mats saved axles and ankles. Tags hang from lampposts with the names of small salvations, a driver who braked when black ice was merely a rumor, a granny who taught a mechanic to sew a sling that did not fail, a boy whose stray dog found the sewer corridor that became a safer route. The archivist walks beside with a ledger that reads like an unassuming gospel: dates, actions, outcomes, lessons. You, who asked for heroes, meet a pantheon of procedures and the hands that love them. In a quiet yard, the battery house hums over a new vocation tending a fleet of ambulances and buses that will carry errands instead of orders. The foundry's heat is now mostly figurative. It pours memory into plaques and fence rails, pours dovetail joints into playgrounds, pours the last of the armor into the first of the benches, where future arguments may become conversations. The threadsmiths cut bolts for roofs and spines for book spines in a library being born from crates where, yesterday, ammunition slept. At dusk, the last forward refuel point deflates its bladders like tents after a festival. The disperser inspects the bare ground and smiles at absence: no spill to haunt a well, no gouge to collect hateful water. The smokesmiths stack canisters with paper labels that say "do not use except at New Year," half joke, half insurance, all testimony that pyrotechnics can learn manners. The decoy rites set fire to a last plywood beast in a controlled pit. Applause rises not for spectacle, but for the relief of endings done right. The army itself learns to fold. The orchestrator of flow inventories what will be given to civic hands, what will be stored with mothballs and promises, what will return through rails to a depot where young mechanics will meet the ghosts of their teachers in torque specs and penciled notes. The standardizer signs the last supplement for a while and writes, at the bottom, a line that sounds like prayer revisit when reality argues. The cipher clerk files a thick envelope of keys and writes a thinner letter to the council about passwords, backups, and the offense against neighbors that is a single point of failure. The oath keeper retires his bent shackle to a school cabinet labeled consequences, tools. Night comes without sirens, which is itself a ceremony. In the kitchens, stock pots simmer because appetite is not partisan. In the tents that are now halls, the chaplain of breath teaches rest as a discipline rather than a collapse. The quartermaster writes a small purchase order for lamp oil and chalk, and the accountant who once feared shrinkage smiles at the line item, unreported kindness as a tradition worth keeping. The motor sergeant, who taught hub temperatures like pulses, shows teenagers how to change a tire without losing dignity. Bridges are walked at midnight by bridge rights who still listen for songs and joints, because vigilance is a love language that does not retire. You wanted a lesson to carry out of the war's echo. It is not complicated, and it is not small logistics, is the refusal to abandon the good, before, during, and after noise. The archetypes remain because the need remains: patient hand, oath keeper, weaver, standardizer, remembrancer, reach, thermist, wintermaster, orchestrator of flow. They change uniforms and keep their vows. The map does not go blank. It fills with circles around schools, clinics, culverts, courtyards, and the quiet arteries that feed them, the rear and the front. Those old opposites finally admit their marriage and promise, in a bureaucracy's modest voice, to keep each other breathing. Morning will come again, and engines will ask to work, and rails will ask to sing, and cranes will ask to lower something precious without dropping it. The pledges that held under fire now hold under sunlight. Steel logistics resupply, repair, and battlefield recovery has done its long poem and hands the last stanza to the city to read aloud whenever thunder threatens sense. What remains is a procession of small excellences, repeated until they are boring, which is how safety likes its hymns sung. The story ends not with a detonation, but with a checklist closed, a light turned off with 2 fingers, and a door latched in a way that refuses both fear and forgetfulness.